Welcome back to the HDR Masterclass, where we're going to continue and conclude our discussion of Photomatix Pro as we move through and do some tone mapping. And so we'll continue where we left off. We had talked about the saturation of highlights. We talked about the saturation and shadows. Now we're going to move on to the shadow smoothness. Now, again, these are in the advanced segment of the adjustments panel. You can certainly hide all of that and not concern yourself with that. But these really are kind of a more of a fine-tuning or a detail type approach to tone mapping your image. Now, if you recall, tone mapping is really all about taking that 32-bit image and then mapping the tones so that they will properly display on an 8-bit display medium, such as an LCD or a printout. So we're also trying to adjust the attributes of the image to get the image to where we like it. We like the image based upon our intentions. We like the image because we've moved it to more of a realistic recording of the scene, or we're doing some creative work with the scene, whatever the case may be. So tone mapping is more than mapping it to a low pixel intensity range of an 8-bit medium. It's also adjusting your image to get it to the point where you like it. So the shadow smoothness, now this will actually adjust the contrast or enhance the contrast of the shadow area. Let me just show that. We'll demonstrate that. If you take a look at the shadowed area right here. Now if I take the shadow smoothness and I really yank it up hard like that, oof, all right, what it did is it adjusted or modified the contrast in the shadow area. And you may actually want a heavy contrast, such as what we're seeing here, but I find not normally. If you're taking a picture of, let's say, all right, the Grand Canyon. There was very intense sun, there was a lot of light, and there was very, very heavy dark shadows that were cast by the rock outcrops. And those are difficult to work with because they're down in the clipping area. If you see here, when I took this shadow smoothness here and I set it to maximum, I actually shifted the tones towards the shadows, and I begin to create a clipping. Clipping is a loss of information, which is what you see here. I actually have a loss of information in the shadow areas. It didn't have much of an impact on my highlights, although it did impact my highlights, but not significantly. Let's just take the shadow smoothness now and adjust it all the way to the minimum and see what happens here. Okay, well that's actually better, but I want more shadows. I want more contrast in my shadows, so I'm going to just double click on that, put that back to its default position, which is 0. All right, so now I'm going to tweak that up ever so slightly here. Okay, good. So now I've actually brought my shadows into something which I consider more realistic. So that shadow smoothness will actually enhance the contrast of the shadows within your scene. Next thing I like to do is turn my attention to shadows clipping. I'm going to yank that all the way up to maximum here and see what effect it has. Whoa. All right, you'll notice the distribution of my tones here. I've basically moved my midtones more towards the dark or the shadows, and I've actually thrown put a lot of noise into my shadows to the point where they have become so dark that they're abnormal. I'm going to double click on that, put it back to its default. Now, do I want any noise in my shadows? I'm just going to do an adjustment like this and kind of see where I'm at. I'm watching the histogram. I'm watching the shadows. I'm watching the loop. I'm watching the histogram, specifically over here on the lower tones. And I actually kind of like it right about there. All right, that's cool. So listen, this image here is not exactly where I want it to be, but I have fairly successfully tone mapped this, and I've also worked with some attributes of the image itself so that I get an image which I think is pretty good. But I'm not done yet. I am not done. The contrast globally across the scene here is not quite where I want it. It's not as crisp as I want it. Keep in mind that when you're working with raw images, the camera has not done any type of sharpening. Raw images tend to be a little soft. So I'm working with raw images here, and there has been no sharpening applied. So not quite where I want to be. Now, but in tone mapping. But tone mapping is not about applying sharpening. It's about mapping the tones from 32-bit to 8-bit. You'll notice up here that I have some defects that have shown up wherever and however they got to be there. They're defects. Those are going to have to be cleaned up. And I also have not quite the look that I want for this black cover on the typewriter. So I have more work to do here. But for purposes of tone mapping, I brought this image from, well, basically 3 8-bit captures, merged, deghosted if that was necessary, and I've actually brought them to a point where I'm pretty happy with this, but I know I'm not done. So for purposes of the demonstration, what we want to do now, let's just assume that you've brought your tone mapping effort as far as you want to go with Photomatix. So let's do this. Let's continue on now. Let's apply this. So what it's doing now is it's applying all of the settings that you've done, which you saw in the preview, and it's going to give me my final tone mapped image. This is the part here with Photomatix that really makes Photomatix shine. This is quick. This is quick. The last thing I want to do is to go make myself a pot of coffee while it's trying to process my images based upon my settings. So Photomatix is very quick in actually applying the settings. Now, I have here something controls I don't really like to use. As much as I like Photomatix Pro, I don't really care to do sharpening, color modification, or contrast on the finishing touch control panel. I like to save that for when I'm actually working with the final image and say something like Photoshop or it could even be GIMP or something else. I don't normally like to do this. Once you apply sharpening to your image here, and I'm just yanking that way up there just to kind of demonstrate. Once you apply sharpening here, you're not going to take it back. It goes, the sharpening is applied to your final image, and that's what you get, and you're stuck with it. I don't like to have Photomatix do any of this. but that's just my personal preference. I typically will continue to work with my final tone mapped image. You'll notice here that I do have some defects that I need to clean up. So I know I'm going to be into additional processing with this image, and the last thing I want to do is to start applying sharpening, which I cannot take back in my other processing methods. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel that, and then we're going to save the image as. Now you'll note here that I have the option to save it as a TIFF 16-bit, a TIFF 8-bit, or a JPEG. Now if you recall, when we talked about JPEG and the JPEG being a lossy, the last thing I want to do is to pick a lossy file format. So I'll typically I will save my images as a TIFF. I like to save them as a TIFF 16-bit because I'm going to get the maximum amount of tones that are going to be stored in my file. Obviously the file is going to be larger, but the TIFF gives me an opportunity to work with a non-lossy, or I should say a minimum lossy file format. If I saved it as a JPEG, then whatever lossiness and compression that I had in that final image is stuck there forever. Once you JPEG, you can never go back. I always save my image as a TIFF, and I typically will save it as a 16-bit. Now the other thing I do is I always save the tone mapping settings, because that enables me to be able to recall this image back into Photomatix Pro, and I can actually go back and resume my tone mapping if I so choose. So I always save the tone mapping settings that will go alongside my image. Okay, I don't really care about open saved images I don't care about that. I'm saving as a TIFF. That will probably be opened by just about any type of fairly decent editing photo editing software. So I've got my TIFF and a 16-bit, and I'm going to save my tone mappings. I'll go ahead and save, and we are done. Now what I could do is I could go load another bracket, and I can start all over. I'm going to do one more thing for you. I am going to close that, and I wanted to be able to show you, we have a clean slate now, I wanted to be able to show you that the reason that I like to save that 32-bit image that we did earlier. So you'll notice here, this is my TIFF. That's my TIFF that I had just saved. Now I can open that up and do other things in other photo editing. I can certainly open it up here again. But what I wanted to show you is that I can actually, remember that HDR file that we saved? That's your 32-bit image file. Now that's never going to display properly on a 8-bit device, but because I saved it, I'm actually able to reopen it in Photomatix Pro. So I'm going to click that and open that, and that's going to open up my 32-bit image. All right, and let's get it back over here. There's my 32-bit image right there, and now I can tone map that all over again. You see? That's why we saved that 32-bit image. I'm back where I started. Now I can do something. I can take this exact same image, and let's just say, let's make it grunge. Okay, so there's my grunge preset. Whoa, okay. If that's what you want, if that's what you're going for, then here you go. There's your preset. So the beauty about being able to recall that 32-bit image is that you can go back in here and you can do a whole nother creative or a whole nother take on this very same image. And you'll notice here I didn't have to plow through the remerging and the deghosting because I saved my 32-bit. So there you go. We have gone through Photomatix. We talked about the adjustments panel, and I did illustrate to you that you don't necessarily have to follow the top-down sequence. Go with what works for you. Take your time, learn them. You'll note here that at the very bottom there is some help, a tip that displays for each one of the controls that you're on. That will give you some idea as to what you're doing. Never be afraid to yank that thing all the way up and then all the way down and get an idea what kind of impact it's having on your image. And if you double click it, you double click it, you put it back to its normal default state. And you've got presets. Don't forget your histogram. That's very important. Keep an eye on your intensity up and down and your distribution left and right of your tonal values, and that will give you a very good idea if you have clipping on the shadow side, clipping on the highlight side, whether or not your tones are predominantly in the low tones or mid tones or high tones. That's a very important part, as well as the visual of the actual image that you're working with. So I hope you found that this Photomatix tone mapping demonstration, I hope you found that it was valuable, informative, but more importantly, I hope that this gives you a springboard by which to work with your HDR software, whatever it may happen to be. Just about everything that we've talked about here you're going to find in other software packages. They may have different names for it, but generally you're trying to move your image to a point where it is 32-bit that has been properly mapped for its tones to be able to display on 8-bit medium, and you're able to do other adjustments. It's a wonderful thing that you can actually work with adjustments on isolated to the low tones or the shadows or the high tones or the highlights. A lot of capabilities in HDR software. But I think that this demonstration gives you a pretty good sense that you're able to work with your field capture sequence, merging them, deghosting them, tone mapping them, adjusting the various attributes of the image, and then being able to save those off even as a lossless TIFF, and perhaps more importantly, be able to save your 32-bit image so that it is essentially future-proofed. And you can go back in and rework with the .hdr file and say you've had some additional ideas, or you looked at your final image from the first tone mapping and you're not quite happy with it and you want to retry it. Well, rather than starting from fresh, you can actually open up your 32-bit file. And who knows, you might be opening up that 32-bit file in 5 years or 10 years. And so you really are in a position where you can future-proof your work quite a bit. So I think that is enough for the demonstration of tone mapping. We're going to continue our discussion in the next segment, where we're going to be wrapping up our total discussion on tone mapping. So please join me in the next segment of the HDR Masterclass, and thank you for your attention as we went through the demonstration of tone mapping.